17 May 1943. Lorient France concrete submarine pens rising from the sea like cliffs of man-made night. Only the spirit of attack, born in a brave heart, will bring success to any fighter aircraft. The sky is a machine before it is a sky. Contrails braid into cold scaffolding. Black bursts of timed steel climb in measured tiers. A box of B-17Fs holds formation, the way a bridge holds a river flexing, but never breaking. Ahead, the armored roofs of Karaman wait. Geometry poured in concrete, while a bombardier breathes through the mask and rides the drift line of a bomb site that wants numbers, not courage. At 25,000 feet, the air is thin, harsh, truer than words. The fortress hums where the turbos bite a steady metallic prayer the crew has learned to trust. They have been here before, counting miles in the language of fuel and frost. In the nose glass turns to bright water with every flash from the flak wall. In the tail, a small square of France moves like a map. Someone keeps folding and unfolding. Between the airplane is 10 men and one decision, repeated until it becomes ritual hold, the interval hold, the speed hold, the line. Head-on fighters make needles of the distance, yellow-nosed shapes that swell far too quickly, and yet the gunners do not shout. They measure lead squeeze and breathe the tracers out as if writing. Wind talks to aluminum. Aluminum answers with a hard, fine buzz that tells the pilot he is on the edge of perfect trim. The ship vibrates with the weight of what it carries and the promise of being lighter in seconds. The interphone is all clipped syllables and breath. The engineer watches temperatures like rosary beads. The navigator's pencil taps and stops. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic light is merciless and clean. It shows everything, including the truth that survival here is a sum of margins earned long before takeoff, turbos aligned, cables, doubled drills practiced until thought gets in the way. The run tightens. The crosshairs settle. The world reduces to a single rectangle of concrete, and the thin white thread of the aiming line crossing its center. Somewhere below, a siren starts and dies. Somewhere behind the formation is a living thing with 100 eyes and one heartbeat. Then the call the crew has trained months to say steps into the air between them, weightless and irrevocable, and the fortress lifts as if remembering how to fly without the burden it was built to deliver. They called it daylight precision bombing, but in the winter of 1942, it was really a set of equations with human margins. From RAF Bassingbourn England to the grey lip of the Bay of Biscay. The 8th Air Force was trying to prove that disciplined geometry could beat a continent, that a grid of altitude, airspeed, and interval could overcome weather and flak and the reflex of a man staring into gunfire. The problem was simple to state and hard to live through: put steel on the one roof tile that mattered and come home with enough aircraft to do it again tomorrow. For that, you needed a platform that kept its promises, a formation that made its own weather, and a doctrine that survived contact with men who learned fast. The airplane gave them the first promise. A B-17F could hold roughly 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and keep breathing clean air behind its turbos where the cold sharpened everything. Its service ceiling near 35,600 feet set a lane above much of the worst flak, though not all. 8.8 cm guns reached effectively to about 26,000 feet, so the safest place was not a sanctuary, but a narrow shelf where seconds were won. The fortress carried redundancy as armor the eye could not see, duplicate control runs, fuel in multiple cells with shutoffs a hand could find, by memory generators and pumps backed by procedures that assumed failure and rehearsed it. None of that killed an enemy. It bought time to think when the sky turned to metal. Doctrine tried to convert that time into accuracy. The briefings drilled a cadence that bordered on prayer, climb to the band level, the box steady, the true airspeed, hand the ship to the bombardier for the last minute, and trust the math. The Norden needed a world without sudden inputs. The pilot trimmed for hands-off. The formation stopped being 12 airplanes and became one mechanical animal with 100 eyes. Inside that creature, the 10 men of each ship broke their fear into tasks. The engineer watched temperatures and pressure as if counting beads. The navigator translated wind into drift and drift into headings you could bet a life on. The radio operator listened for a word that meant escorts were near or gone. The gunners learned to breathe the sight in and the trigger out until tracers felt like punctuation rather than panic. The second promised survivability belonged to the formation. Alone, a bomber was a target with a schedule. In a box, overlapping arcs of 50 caliber fire turned space into a lattice that punished the first mistake and dared a second. The Luftwaffe tested that lattice until they found its weak geometry, a head-on slice at high closure where the nose of the F model was thinly guarded and a few cannon shells could erase a crew before anyone could say a word. Losses told the story in numbers the staff could not ignore. December 1942 touched 8.8% for some raids, and the arithmetic of replacement did not forgive that slope. Then they realized that discipline was a weapon. Tighten the intervals. Stagger the elements so the upper turrets could scissor across the forward hemisphere. Teach the cheek gunners to track high 12 as a reflex. Make the box so rigid in speed and spacing that a fighter had to pick a line through fire rather than around it. The escort problem framed the stakes. Spitfires could shepherd the climb and the first miles across the channel, but not the run to distant pens and yards. Early P-47s stretched the umbrella farther, yet there were still long minutes when the contrails thinned and the radio fell to breathing, and the only friends in the sky were the ships you could see off your wing. Those were the bomber gap minutes where decisions grew teeth. Hold course and trust the cones of fire. Do not chase a falling comrade. Keep the turn shallow enough that the ball turret can stay on a single bandit long enough to matter. Survival lived in the space between two bad options. Training kept crews from choosing the catastrophic third. The German problem was the mirror image. They had to break a formation that multiplied its fire faster than a single attacker could absorb. That meant Doctrine 2 drill the head-on time, the approach for the instant, before the bombardier called his release force, the leader to flinch and let flak finish the wounded. It worked until it didn't, and the hinge was not a miracle but the slow erosion of advantage. A frontal pass cost airframes and pilots they couldn't replace on the same schedule. A box that learned to hold speed within a few miles per hour to correct drift without telegraphing, to keep the nose guns alive with practiced arcs, took a percentage point here, a percentage point there, and moved the loss curve off the cliff. Weather set the ceiling on human intention. Ice tried to thicken on leading edges and inside oxygen masks. The cold made aluminum ring with a brittle note that pilots could feel through the yoke. The superchargers sang a thin, high key when the mixture and boost were right. A different note meant a slow drift toward a stall that might not announce itself until the nose fell. In that edge of trim world, fuel became the hidden stake. Range near 2,000 miles on paper collapsed into a handful of hard choices when headwinds cut ground speed and a wounded engine drank more than its share. The navigator's pencil became the most dangerous instrument aboard. Turn early and miss the target. Turn late and miss England. On the ground, the arithmetic wore uniforms and learned to be humble. Schedules pretended that airframes were interchangeable and crews were digits. Maintenance chiefs and armorers knew better. They traced flak holes with fingers and measured the elastic give in a spar after a hard pullout, and chose which ship would take a rookie and which demanded a veteran's touch. Each decision bled into the next briefing until the whole group carried a personality cautious at altitude changes, aggressive on rally turns, slow to call aborts or quick. The Belle lived inside that culture. Her crew were not different men. They stood on a narrow ridge of engineering and habit that their unit had built under them. And always at the edge of the map lay the thing both sides could feel without naming. If the fortresses could hold discipline long enough for escort doctrine to grow across the deep water, the calculus of the air war would tilt. The Belle did not know the future. She only knew the next route line and the weight of her bomb load and the way a steady ship makes other men steady. The stakes were not flags or speeches. They were whether the formation would come home with enough ships to brief again, and whether the men who watched them through gun sights would still be there to meet them. In that narrow space between numbers and nerves, the campaign's logic took root. The fortress begins as a set of forces balanced in aluminum. For Wright R-1820-97s breathe thin air through General Electric turbos that spool like dental drills, each impeller taking cold, starved oxygen and packing it until the mixture burns clean at 25,000 feet. The pilot can feel the moment the boost comes on an almost weightless surge, as if the ship has been quietly forgiven, and he trims until the yoke is a suggestion rather than a lever. Then the airplane turns its numbers into a habit, about 287 miles per hour, true a service ceiling, near 35,600 feet if the weight and weather permit, and a steady line through the part of the flak envelope where the math is least cruel. The Germans tune their fuses for altitude bands like rungs. The fortress climbs until it stands on the highest rung it can hold, without tearing something you can't replace in flight. Inside, redundancy masquerades as clutter. Control cables double back along the fuselage like tendons with spares braided beside them. Fuel lives in multiple cells, some self-sealing, some not. Each with a shutoff the engineer can reach with his eyes closed. The electrical system is parceled into little sovereignties, so a wound cannot depose an entire kingdom. Heat snakes forward from the wing roots and still cannot keep pace with the cold. Gloves stiffen. The bombardier's breath fogs the plexiglass until he learns to angle his face away. Oxygen becomes a ritual of rubber and rhythm. At altitude, forgetting the cadence by half a minute writes a man's epitaph in a sentence. The nose is the ship's cathedral of glass and computation. The Norden swings in a slow, patient arc, its gyros spinning toward a private calm. When the pilot couples the C-1 autopilot to the bombsight, authority shifts. With a small thump, you feel more than hear. The airplane begins to ghost along a line that only the bombardier can see, correcting, for crosswind, in increments so microscopic a nervous hand would destroy them. He watches drift needles whisper across their scales, fingers light on the vernier wheels, and holds the crosshair on a slab of concrete that shrinks, swells, and steadies as if arguing with him. Then they realized that accuracy at altitude is less about a miraculous device than about the discipline required to give it a steady world constant true airspeed level wings, the quiet humility of not touching the controls unless the bombsight asks. Farther aft, the ball turret hangs like an eye that forgot to blink. Its electric motors hum against the slipstream. Inside, a boy wraps himself around twin 50s, whose receivers smell of oil and warm steel. The muzzle velocity, about 290 feet per second, writes straight grammar in the air. At 400 yards, he aims a little low so a closing fighter climbs into his tracers. Above him, the top turret is the metronome of the formation, tracking 12 o'clock high, with a patient sweep that refuses to be hurried by the shape of fear. The cheek guns are lessons learned the hard way. Their arcs have been rehearsed until the gunners' forearms know the lead better than their eyes. Then they realized that the forward hemisphere could be managed by choreography, upper and cheek arcs crossing like scissors if, and only if, the box held speed within a few miles per hour and spacing within a breath. The structure forgives more than pride expects. A spar takes a scar and still keeps the wing honest. A control surface goes light, and the pilot knows which cable is gone, which tab can shoulder the work. Armor plates the pilot's seat and the belly under the cockpit. But the true armor is distributed, a lattice of small decisions made by designers who assumed the worst and rehearsed it at a drafting table. A flak fragment cuts a hydraulic line. A hand pump and a checklist close the breach. An engine runs hot. The cowl flaps take a bigger bite of the slipstream. The ship loses a little speed to buy a little time. The airplane sells minutes for miles and never pretends it is doing anything else. Radio is the nervous system that keeps a formation a formation. VHF carries the clipped phrases that stitch squadrons and groups. Interphone carries breadth and brevity, the engineer's numbers, the navigator's headings, the bombardier's one-word absolutes. In between lives, jamming and silence, and the old wisdom that the most dangerous sound is nothing at all. When escorts peel at the edge of their range, the radios go thin, and the contrails ahead stop being friendly punctuation and start being questions. The fortress answers with geometry. Elements stagger vertically by dozens of feet to clear arcs, laterally by wingspans to keep wake and gunfire from eating each other, longitudinally by the seconds it takes to keep a bomb pattern tight without cutting a tail off in a turn. The enemy's engineering is written into every decision. A head-on FW-190 presents a brief lethal equation. Closure rates near 600 miles per hour mean a firing window measured in heartbeats. His MG-151 cannon throw heavier shells that can peel the nose like fruit if they arrive together. The fortress, therefore, speaks in cones rather than barrels. It does not aim at a single airplane so much as it fills a volume of sky where math says a fighter must pass. The Luftwaffe gunnery tables and the fortress's harmonization charts are two halves of the same book, and each side reads the other by feel. When a fighter breaks the box, he often leaves pieces of himself behind. When he doesn't, he leaves new lessons. Even the bombs are governed by patience. Weight determines altitude, and altitude determines survivability and accuracy. A heavy load drags the formation into thicker flak. A lighter one buys height and thin air, where fragments lose energy faster. Fusing and interval are the bombardier's vote in that argument, calibrated to crack concrete rather than scatter drama. The ship lifts at release because the world has suddenly become simpler by 6,000 pounds, and the pilot's hands remember that flight without parsing why. What emerges from all of this is not romance but repeatability. The airplane's physics make promises, the crew's habits keep them, and the formation's discipline multiplies them until one machine becomes many and many behave like one. To the men watching through gun sights on the other side, the impression is not of invincibility but of resilience. They can see damage, hear the flak, do its work, watch a fortress limp, and still watch her hold a line no wounded thing should hold. That is the quiet edge the Belle carries, not a talisman, not a story's luck, but a stack of margins engineered on the ground and paid out in the cold a little at a time until the target is behind and the sea is ahead and the numbers begin to favor home. They learn the enemy by inches. A week after a raid that stitched black craters along the rails near Amiens, the Belle forms on the lid ship under a lid of weather that makes contrails smear into gray ribbons. The climb is a matter of faith mixture, set boost steady, the superchargers whispering their high metallic note until sunlight breaks the top layer, and the formation finds itself in a cathedral of blue. Far ahead, the channel is a brightness. Beneath the cloud deck is a white field where shadows of bombers slide like slow birds. For a minute, the sky is empty. Then the first dots appear at 12 high and small and begin to grow. The head-on doctrine is a geometry lesson you feel in the mouth of your stomach. The Focke-Wulfs roll inverted, drop their noses, and knife down the center line, where the nose of the B-17F is glass and thin aluminum and hope. Closure approaches 600 miles per hour, and time compresses into the size of a fist. In the cheek windows, the gunners breathe the sight picture alive and learn to let it drift, lead a little low, let the fighter climb into the stream. The top turret scissor tracks with the ship on the right element, and the ball turret hums a patient circle, defying the instinct to yank at a target that is all teeth and sunlight. The first pass is always a dare. Will the box blink and throw the fine, even speed that makes Norden math work? The answer is no. The wings stay level. The pilot lets the bombsight fly. The ship's shudder is only the airframe reminding everyone it is mortal. Somewhere above, one of the attackers takes a thread of tracers full in the wing root and leaves a black paragraph on the sky. No one cheers. Cheer breaks discipline. The crew inventory their bodies with the small motions of hands and tongue. The interphone holds its clipped syllables. They run the bomb run like a ceremony and turn as a single creature, a dozen airframes pivoting around a point no one can see, but everyone can feel. On the way out, the cloud deck tears open, and the flak finds them again in gray stairsteps. A fragment punches through the navigator's table, and the pencil that had been measuring drift becomes a splinter. He picks a new one, checks the watch, and writes the next heading with a steadier hand than he thought he owned. Days later, the Belle's group shares airspace with lessons they didn't ask for. A ship 2 boxes over takes a hit that opens the nose like a door. It slips out of formation, bleeding altitude in a slow, helpless spiral. Doctrine says, do not follow a wounded friend into a geometry where the box no longer protects you. Doctrine wins the argument. The tail gunner watches the cripple go until it disappears into the cloud. He will remember that vanishing for years, a private weather system in his sleep. The engineer wary since Amarillo counts the reasons the Belle is still one engine failure, from flyable to from a prayer. He checks fuel transfers again, a ritual against doubt. On a day when the target lies deeper than the escorts can reasonably reach, the silence after the last P-47 rocks away is physical. Radios crackle, then thin, then go to that special kind of quiet that has mass. The contrail ahead grows a dark core. Those are not friends. The first attack is slashing, this time from 2 o'clock high, FW-190s rolling through a shallow dive that trades altitude for raking fire along the box's face. The upper turrets take the lead, crossing arcs so precisely drilled that the gunners can predict the other man's swing. In the nose, the bombardier lifts fingers off the vernier wheels to keep from overcorrecting. The autopilot is coupled, and the ship moves on rails he alone can see. When the bombs go, the ship's sudden lightness is a physical relief that reads as joy in the body, even when the mind is still counting threats. On the ground, the other half of the incidents accumulate in notebooks and hangars. German engineers crawl over a wreck in a hedgerow and mutter professionally at the redundancy they find. 2 parallel control runs, both damaged, one still barely functional, because a fragment cut only partway through the cable. Glassed-in nose with a bombsight cradle that tells them something about American priorities. Fuel shutoffs labeled with such blunt clarity a man can use them by feel. They had mocked the weight in mess conversations. Here weight wears a new name: resilience. They carry fragments of self-sealing liner to a bench and slice them to learn how many shots they can take before they bleed for good. They file the report. In squadron briefings for the next week, head-ons are still doctrine, but the notes at the bottom grow longer about cost. The Americans run their own captured kit school too. A BF-109 painted with British roundels arrives for demonstration, rolled out on a cold morning, with frost still bright in the grass. Ground crewmen in greasy wool watch a test pilot make a clean takeoff and a climbing turn that shows the airplane's bite. He lands and talks about roll rate versus speed, about the way the nose hides the sight line for a second, in a head-on pass about cannon recoil walking the sight off-center. Gunners take notes they will never read again, because by now the numbers have already climbed into their hands. The lesson is not how to win a duel. The lesson is how to create a volume of sky a hunter must fly through to get a shot, and how to fill that volume without panicking and wasting belts. Mid-March brings a sortie over rail yards that thread a city like nerves. Weather throws knives. Ice creeps on leading edges and retreats. Oxygen masks rasp. The pilot trims against turbulence that keeps trying to write their names on the deck below. The lead ship makes a small correction too late, and the pattern ripples. Everyone feels it, but no one speaks. The bombardier persuades the crosshair back to the mark, and the intervalometer ticks the string across a rectangle of roofs that were 5 minutes ago a blur. Outbound, a cannon shell slices the Belle's radio aerial. The radio operator is suddenly alone inside a bubble of silence that wobbles with every gust. He traces the brake runs, the checklist for the whip, and brings a different voice back online with the patience of a man knitting in a gale. The interim admissions are never written as poetry. A German staff officer notes that frontal attacks achieve effect, but at unsustainable expense against tight formations. An American group intelligence summary observes that cheek gunners with extended training hours significantly reduce pilot reports of cockpit hits. 2 sentences, 2 truths. Then they realized that the contest would not be decided by a new trick, but by the slow, stubborn perfection of old ones. Spacing you can measure with a boot sole on the wing. Drift corrections in half needles, a refusal to yank at terror when it rushes straight at you. The incidents keep rising and breaking like surf. The men stop seeing them as waves and begin to feel the tide. Reliability in war is not drama. It is repetition that refuses to fail. Before dawn at Bassingbourn, the ground echelon rolls their tool carts like altar servers' hands, black with graphite and sealant, knowing exactly which cowling screw on each engine is reluctant and which magneto shows a temper when cold. They chase tolerances as if hunting wind plug gaps to a feeler's whisper, turbo linkages to the half-turn control cable tension by fingertip memory. A fortress leaves the pan not because luck has chosen it, but because 50 quiet choices have removed places where luck could speak. When a ship like the Belle meets weather and cannon and steel, it carries that scaffolding of ordinary excellence inside its skin. Training turns that scaffolding into decisions. Checklists become a language the crew speaks under stress without accents. Engine out drill mixture. Rich prop, low RPM throttle back, feather count the blades, to stillness, trim for the asymmetric pull, add a degree or two of rudder, and let the ship breathe before you demand more. Oxygen discipline becomes a metronome. A man who fumbles a connector learns to hear his pulse slow as the world narrows, and he never forgets again. Fire drill is choreography extinguishers by position, fuel shutoffs by muscle memory, a hatch cracked at the right moment to make the slipstream a servant rather than a master. Then they realized that courage at altitude is mostly obedience to procedures rehearsed until pride goes quiet. Radios make discipline a shared object. VHF stitches formations terse and bright. Interphone carries the intimate pulse of the ship. HF whispers to England, and sometimes to nobody. In the clear words are expensive. Brevity codes by seconds. Tally announces fighters without drama. Bandit 12 paints an entire hemisphere for gunners who already have their arcs memorized. When jamming falls across a frequency like wool, the formation collapses back to geometry, and time hacks, and the discipline holds. The navigator's minute marks become a skeleton. The group pivots on those bones through cloud and flak, because they have agreed days earlier to trust a pencil more than adrenaline. Fuel is the hidden clock. The Belle's tanks carry arithmetic as cargo climb burn that hurts until turbos take the load, cruise burn that stabilizes into something you can plan a life around contingency that feels like a superstition until an engine runs rough and begins drinking like a wounded animal. Transfers are not improvisations. They are rituals the engineer performs with a valve body he could sketch with his eyes shut. Headwinds shave ground speed in small, merciless bites. The navigator shades an isochrone and shows the pilot that the straightest line home is sometimes a shallow dogleg that slides between weather and flak. The ship obeys the numbers even when the body wants to descend toward thicker air and softer feelings. Doctrine keeps men from turning emergencies into catastrophes. Abort criteria are briefed like law oil temp beyond tolerance on climb oxygen system, compromised an instrument failure that will deform a bomb run turn. Now accept the shame you will not feel tomorrow, because you will be alive to brief again. Rally points are not drawings. They are promises if the box fractures under weather or fire. Regroup here at this altitude, on that minute, on this heading. It is how a crippled element becomes a formation, again visibly smaller, and yet somehow whole. The Belle lives inside those promises. When contrails go to chaos and flak writes black grammar through the air, a familiar voice still calls the rally, and men follow a place they cannot yet see. Reliability is also the way the airplane forgives damage without theatrics. A fragment cuts the aileron cable. The pilot discovers he can fly on trim and muscle because the designers planned for a day when steel teeth would chew the obvious path. A ball turret motor stutters. A crank handle that looked like an anachronism brings the gunner home. A generator dies, and the other systems take up the slack, as if they knew this conversation was coming. Every redundancy costs weight. Every pound is an argument. Yet the ledger keeps balancing at altitude in cold that makes aluminum sing. The men who mocked weight learn to bless it the first time a fortress holds straight and level with fewer functioning parts than common sense would allow. On the adversary's side of the canopy, the logic becomes visible. A pilot rolling into a frontal pass discovers that the formation's cones of fire do not blink. The box has learned to keep true airspeed steady to the knot, and spacing to a breath, so the opening through which he planned to slide is gone. He sees tracers that are not wild but braided, and he flinches one beat early because two turrets cross precisely where his sight picture should bloom. He finds his courage intact and his timetable ruined, and in that mismatch lives the Belle's margin. Then they realized that the most dangerous enemy in the sky was not a single bomber with an ace at the controls, but 100 ordinary crews who behaved like one organism. Weather once a tyrant becomes a tool. The group learns which altitudes lift icing faster than it forms, How to ride a temperature layer that makes flak fuse late when to accept a thin scud over the channel, because it will break into blue on the French side. Pathfinders will come later. For now, a lad bombardier with a feel for wind drift becomes a local prophet, and the rest of the box makes faith a technical act. Hold him in calm air, give him constant inputs, let the gyro find peace. When cloud swallows the world, the pilot flies instruments like scripture wings, level ball-centered, needles cross. The ship stops being dramatic and becomes honest. Back on the pan, the cycle closes with grease and paper. Armorers load belts in a rhythm that hears yesterday's jam and answers it with a different link count. Crew chiefs chalk tiny notes on cowlings that only their pilots will understand. Intelligence officers pin photographs that sharpen the next run's aim by a street and a shadow. Nothing is glorious. Everything is exact. And when the bell lifts again into a morning that looks like any other. What keeps her alive is not myth, but the plain machinery of reliability, training radios, fuel, and doctrine. Ordinary words that together become a fortress the enemy cannot easily erode. They do not know it is an ending until the sky changes flavor. Outbound. From Lorient, the bell feels newly light, a fraction higher on the step, the bomb bay clean, and the ship breathing easier through thin air that stings the face wherever a mask leaks. The turn-off target has shaken the box but not broken it. Wings realign by instinct more than order, and the needles settle as if the air itself has decided to be reasonable. In the nose, the bombardier rests his hands on the frame and lets the C-1 give control back with that small, familiar thump. In the tail, France slides away in square miles of gray and green that he knows he will see at night forever. The interphone is all breath and syllables that barely count as words. The hard truth ahead is a clock and a number. 25. If they carry that home, they will never have to do this again. The Luftwaffe makes its last argument with the certainty of a doctrine that has cost too much to abandon. Two specks, hard, high at 2 o'clock, grow teeth and wings and yellow noses. They roll dive obliquely and try to rake the box's face into disorder. The top turrets begin their measured sweep arcs, crossing with the grace of 2 practiced hands. The cheek gunners keep the cone alive without snatching at the sight picture, and the ball turret hums with that patient tone the crew can feel in their ribs. The bell herself answers with steadiness. True airspeed holds inside a narrow band, the kind of discipline that looks like calm from outside and feels like a knife edge from the pilot's seat. Then they realized on both sides of the gun sights that the decisive weapon is not a single burst or a single hero, but a pattern held under fear. A German pilot makes a frontal try that would have succeeded in the winter. He measures the closure by feel, sees the nose glass swelling, tastes the reflex to fire early, and fights it down. At the instant, his sight blooms 2 cones of 50 cross precisely where his plan lives. He flinches half a heartbeat, because survival is suddenly a matter of angles instead of nerve. He gets his burst off short, professional, and breaks away with a canopy peppered, and the sense of having pushed at a door that used to open and now only flexes. He levels glances back and watches the box refuse to unravel. For him, the inflection is not a speech or a memo. It is the quiet knowledge that the price of a kill has gone up again. Flak returns in phrases, not paragraphs. Black puffs step the altitude band like an exhausted runner. The fuses are close but not perfect. The stair steps a half measure out of time, with a formation that will not hold still. Fragments rattle the nose and drum the wings, and write small, forgettable sentences in aluminum. Nothing hits the line that would turn control into prayer. The navigator draws his pencil through a dogleg chosen before takeoff, and it matches the wind like a lock finding its key. The engineer watches temperatures and pressures and calls them in low, even numbers that in any other place would sound like a lullaby. The pilot trims one more hair's breadth and feels the ship tighten into that rare state where it flies itself as long as no one panics. Ahead, the horizon grows crowded with dots that do not behave like hunters. The first escorts appear as if time itself has brought them sleek shapes orbiting the outbound path contrails braided rather than knifed. No one cheers. The body makes a different sound, a long breath, released a stiffness leaving shoulders that did not know they were stone. The radios fill with a static that is almost friendly. The escorts slide into position, one with the indifference of professionals, and the effect is immediate. The last tentative enemy probe peels away without testing the lattice again. The lesson locks in at the speed of relief, when protection reaches the target line and the homeward leg, the geometry of the air war tilts. The hard metric of the day is not altitude or speed, but the count the 25th crossed the promise earned. For the Belle, the climax is not a burst of noise, but the absence of it. Level at altitude, with the channel starting to glitter under a break in the cloud, the crew discovers that silence can be as loud as flak. The bombardier checks the intervalometer out of reflex and finds it empty. The radio operator touches the new aerial repair as if to see whether it is still real. The tail gunner realizes he has been leaning forward into his harness for an hour and lets himself settle back, bones rediscovering the shape of a seat. The pilot looks at the engine gauges and for once sees numbers that agree with the manual more than with experience. Then they realized that survival could feel ordinary, that the machine, the training, and the box could make a near-death ritual resolve into a commute. Eye level across the divide, a German flak captain finishes a correction that would have walked his pattern into the center of the formation 5 months ago. He watches the bursts hang a fraction low, curses his timing, and understands without rhetoric that his battery and the fighters above will not extract the price they need today. He writes a neat line in his log, unremarkable in tone, ineffective at altitude due to speed stability of the enemy box. It is the driest possible sentence, and it is the beginning of a strategic verdict. His realization arrives without drama. You cannot bleed a machine that refuses to present a wound. England returns in details a coastline that looks like a memory, a radio beacon's thin pulse fields that remember rain. The group slides down through a layer that smells of damp earth and coal smoke. Wheels touch, and the fortress rumbles into a world with bicycles against Nissen huts and men in stained coveralls counting holes like accountants count coins. The Belle's engines run down in uneven steps, and the sudden stillness makes everyone hear their own hearts. Ground crew cluster under the nose art with grins they don't bother to hide. Someone slaps aluminum and says nothing. Someone else draws a chalk 25 in figures so big a man could see them from the perimeter track. The inflection point takes final shape on the debrief map in greased pencil and soft voices. The line out, the turn, the cuts through, weather. The attacks absorbed, the return, all of it ordinary. In retelling, all of it balanced on a single number that will go into the records and then into the story. No miracle is claimed. The crew knows what brought them here, a design that forgives, a doctrine that refuses to blink, radios that keep a formation. A formation. Fuel that obeys a plan rather than a fear, escorts arriving where they must. The adversary knows it too, though they will phrase it differently. 25 is just arithmetic until the day you reach it. After that, it becomes an argument won. They land into a silence that feels earned rather than gifted. England smells of wet grass and coal and tea, cooling in enamel mugs on a bench outside a Nissen hut. Bicycles lean like punctuation against corrugated metal. The Belle sits with the heat still in her engines and the dust of France in her seams. A ground crewman climbs the ladder and lays a hand on the cowling as if taking a pulse, and when the props click to a full stop, the field holds its breath and then remembers to exhale. 25 is painted in chalk under the nose art, too large for modesty, exactly right for truth. Debrief is a room of penciled arcs and coffee rings where adrenaline has nowhere left to go. The navigator traces a dog leg that matched the wind like a lock fitting its key. The engineer logs temperatures that never lied. The bombardier, all bone-tired grace, draws a rectangle around a concrete pen and says nothing because his work is arithmetic, and the arithmetic is done. An intelligence officer marks the head-on passes with a grease pencil and writes the same note he has written for months, with one small addition. Disciplined spacing equals survivability. It sounds like a line on a board. It feels like a hand at the small of your back steadying you over a threshold. What comes next is strangely louder. Stateside factory floors will stop for the sight of her riveters, with cotton in their ears, lifting their heads as an aluminum celebrity rolls between drill presses and banners. In cities that have watched casualty telegrams arrive like bad weather, a B-17 with a girl on her nose will become a parade 1 block long and 1 story tall a promise you can put your hand on. The crew will wave like men deputized by history. They will answer questions about luck with practiced courtesy and leave out the part about the quiet that follows a flak burst when you wait to see if your hands still answer to you. The airplane's afterlife will be stranger still. Paint weathers, plywood scaffolds appear. Curators speak the soft language of salvage and provenance. A museum hangar will smell of old dope and new primer. The past will be measured in rivet lines and the exact shade of olive drab remembered by photographs and argument. People will come with their children and stand in front of the nose and say the name out loud, as if the syllables could make a country's memory more precise. They will peer through glass at a bomb site that once asked for stillness and now asks for reverence, and they will learn that accuracy was not a miracle, but a ritual of patience. Across the vanished gun sites, the adversary's ledger closes in a different ink. Flak officers write tidy sentences about ineffective bursts at altitude when formations hold speed. Fighter leaders mark losses that are individually explainable and collectively unsustainable. Doctrine grinds against the limits of replacement pools and weather and time. An air war that once felt like a duel becomes an attrition problem, with answers written by factories and fuel and the length of an escort's shadow. The realization is not a trumpet blast. It is a line in a logbook that stops being argued over. The men who flew her will be scattered back into the kind of life that does not normally share air with destiny. They will learn to sleep without oxygen masks and to love without countdowns in their headsets. They will carry private museums in their bodies, a scar where a buckle dug into a rib, a sound that arrives in winter like a visitor, the thin whine of a supercharger rising clean, and a habit of checking wind without meaning to. If they talk about courage, they will talk about checklists. If they talk about luck, they will talk about margins engineered on the ground and guarded in the air until they added up to a landing. And somewhere in a book written after the smoke has thinned, an enemy ace will be quoted. Only the spirit of attack, born in a brave heart, will bring success to any fighter aircraft, and the words will ring true across the divide because attack and defense were never opposites here. They were two ways of refusing to blink. The opening shock becomes the closing echo, concrete pens under a cold sky, flak stepped like stairs, a box that would not break. The machine and the men taught each other how to survive, and the lesson outlived them both, carried forward in quiet things, numbers rehearsed, until they sounded like prayer, discipline held until fear ran out of room, and an airplane that kept its promises long enough to become a story.